What are the odds that there's still an NHL franchise in Atlanta if you write this book while you're covering the Thrashers?
I don't think I could have influenced it at all, but I still get asked about Atlanta a lot. I don't think they're done in the NHL, so they'll be
my little guy. I don't know. He got his older cousin gave him some hand-me-down hockey cards, and there was some Atlanta Thrasher jerseys in there, and he's like, "What are?" He goes, "Those are the coolest jerseys I've ever seen in my life." He's like, "How come they're not around anymore?" And I'm like, "Long story, big
It's a long story."
So, yeah. I learned something reading this book that we have in common, and that is that we're both Detroit Lions fans.
Oh wow!
And I couldn't help but draw the parallels to franchise building and what's going on in Detroit with Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, and it's been great theater these last 2 years.
So it's funny because this is like the first time in my lifetime it's cool to like the Lions, or people get excited outside of Detroit about talking Lions. And I was just talking to the host of our athletic football show, and I said they were talking about Campbell and exactly what you're saying, culture building and how it's different. And they called him the model franchise in the NFL, which I'm still wrapping my head around.
Like literally.
And I just sent him a note, and I'm like, hey, I think it's worth mentioning. None of this probably happens the way it's happening without Sheila Ford Hamp. Like, there was an ownership change. There's a regime change at the top. I mean, same Ford family, but different person running it. And I think Sheila, I don't think it's a coincidence that there was ineptitude for a long time in this franchise, and then you have somebody at the top who's different, and it changes, and now the culture is completely different, and now they're succeeding. That to me seems, without knowing the details, I'm just a fan of the Lions, but it doesn't seem coincidental to me.
No, I would agree with you. She's if you watch the Inside the Den, like their kind of YouTube in-house documentary, it's so good, and she's so good, and you certainly get the vibe that there's just so much trust that she places in people and letting them do their job, which seems obvious to do, but you would know better than me. I sense that that's maybe not always the case in professional sports.
Yeah.
I'll also note that I took my oldest guy to the Lions Packers on Thanksgiving last year, first time in Ford Field, and the tailgating around there, because it's all right in the city. And I bought this T-shirt in a back alley that says MCDC in like old ACDC font. And then on the back, it says, "We live for this shit." And I wear that every Sunday. And my wife has said, if you will get served divorce papers if you ever step foot out of our home with that shirt on. Like, she just hates
Too bad.
It,
it's a great shirt.
Yeah, it is a great
shirt.
I love
that. This is such an aside. My favorite shirt my kids ever had, we bought when my oldest was born, like a onesie, and it was ABCD in the ACDC logo. It just cracked me up. I'm like, it's simple dad joke, but I was like, this is great.
Totally.
Sorry, didn't mean to get sidetracked.
Oh, it's all good, man. How did you select the folks that you were going to focus on for the book? Because I just, that really struck me. I'm like, man, that must have been really challenging.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. There was some people I wanted in no matter what. So when I was reporting this out, this book took a few years to do, and the Tampa Bay Lightning were kind of the peak team. So there was Julien BriseBois, who I was like, okay, he has to be in this book. This is where I'm starting. I wanted Lou Lamoriello in there because I've just, here's somebody who's been doing it a long time, has had success not just in hockey, but he's been part of successful teams in baseball and basketball, ran an athletics department in Providence. So I just thought there was a lot to learn there from Lou, and also the challenge. You don't read a ton about Lou, really, and he's not somebody who generally opens up. So there was kind of a few, I wouldn't say non-negotiables, but then once I started the reporting, I kind of let one go into the other. So I talked to Lou, and it seemed really natural to go from Lou to Kyle Dubas, who, I talked to Lou a lot about Kyle, and I think people, I've gotten asked this a couple of times, but there's a lot of Maple Leaf stuff in a book about winning championships, which I can grant it's a fair criticism. But I also didn't want to just say, hey, these are the last 10 Stanley Cup winners. I'm like, here's different people at different parts of their career So you bring in Lou, that you bring in Kyle, who I think there's a lot to learn from, especially his experience under Lou Lamoriello, and then all the things that the decisions he had to face. And so then it just kind of one led to the other. Then I'll give you a story. Like I was asking about the Maple Leafs exit interview strategy coming off another playoff exit,
Yeah.
and Kyle said he talked, he went through all the players and how those conversations went. And then, they basically were trying to figure out whether or not to blow things up, or, do you make a major trade? Is this the time? All the questions that always surround Toronto. And, he told me he called Brian McClellan, who went through the same thing with the Washington Capitals, and basically said, I'm not going to say what that conversation was, but, it really was impactful. And so naturally I'm like, I got to know what the conversation was. So that led to,
I need to ask
yeah.
you that. I want to know what the conversation was. You kind of tease it out, I think, at the end
Yeah.
of that chapter, but
So, what happened was he talks to Brian. I go down to the NHL GM meetings in, I think it was Boca Raton or one of those, they never hold these in Winnipeg or whatever. It was a
I was going
nice
to say,
resort.
yeah,
And, I go there and I asked Brian, and it was fascinating. I said, he said, yeah, I shared Kyle, we had lost to the Penguins. You remember those just terrible
yeah.
playoff losses for the
It was
Capitals,
like 2 or 3 years in a
heartbreaking.
row, wasn't it?
Yeah, 2 or 3 years in a row. And
Yeah.
he's like, we did our exit interviews and they were excruciating. And I actually, for the book, I talked to Brooks Orpik, who I think was the first of the exit interviews, and he gave some great details. So Brian says, you know, we do these exit interviews after this heartbreaking loss, and two very clear things came from the players. They're like, we need to do these two things. It was like a mandate from the players. And I'm like, awesome, Brian. What were those two things? And he goes, I can't tell you. So, and he's like, and I'm like, so I'm like, okay, oh, great. And he goes, but I will say we didn't do either of them. And so I found that really fascinating. That there was a mandate from the players essentially, in management and ownership didn't decline to do it. So now I'm like, okay, I've got to talk to the owner. And so went to Washington D.C., talked to Ted Leonsis. You know, we weren't talking about those two things specifically, but one thing he said came out of those was Nick Backstrom asked for a trade, and was
Yeah.
and said basically, I don't believe this is not working. And after the Penguins lost,
Well, I
and
think specifically in the
yeah,
book, that he doesn't know if like him and Ovi could coexist.
essentially, like those two were.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, I don't, I don't know if it was. I don't think there was animosity. It was just like, this is not like whatever happened. Like Nick Backstrom was like, part of the solution has to be me leaving, essentially. And so Ted Leonsis, again, here's ownership saying no. Like the message from them was, we're not blowing this up at this time. And then of course they go out and win the Stanley Cup. And Ted tells this great story, and they're on like the third level of the team hotel at this huge party, and they're all celebrating. And like Backstrom comes to him in tears, and it's just like, thank you, like thanks for basically ignoring me. And like all that, it makes for a great story. And it was like, it was a fun thing to try to like thread to pull. But I also, and I mentioned it in this book, but I mean, if you remember, the Capitals probably should have lost in the first round to the Columbus Blue Jackets. They were down 2 games. They lost 2 games at home. Yeah. And then they go into overtime. Panarin hits a post. Like all these, like Columbus was dominating play. It should. The only reason I was at that game was to go write about Barry Trotz being fired, which was going to happen. And they win the game, and then they go on to win the Stanley Cup. And so I'm just fascinated how. So now we get to write this great story about how the Capitals, held the line and it won a Stanley Cup, when also there was, they were an inch away or whatever from losing. And it's crazy.
You know what? It's so funny. Like Barry's been on the show, and he shared like that playoff run. Like one of the benefits he had is he knew it was probably the end, so he just
Yeah.
did his thing. Like I didn't feel like he had anything to save it for, and just went with it. And I think that was probably one thing that I kept ruminating about was if I didn't follow sports, if somebody just came to me and said, "Hey, Aaron, we want you to be the GM of an NHL team." And you gotta learn how to do it. And if I picked up a copy of your book, one of probably the key tenets that I would take away is be patient.
Yeah.
Be
Yeah.
patient.
Yeah,
And
for
I
sure.
and I kept reading, and I'm like, yeah, but it's so counterintuitive, despite there being so many examples of patience paying off. it is probably the least patient industry that I can think of across just about anything.
Yeah, you're right. I think that that theme played throughout. I also think I think there's good examples of people being really decisive. Again, Lou Lamoriello, like, wasn't patient with coaches. He expressly said the opposite. Like, the second you sense something is off, make a change and make those difficult decisions. So I think there's an element of being patient, being convicted in your beliefs. If you really believe this group of players can win, then ignoring all of the noise and sticking with it. But also, there's a chapter again. This is like going back to your first question. All the capital stuff led me to Vegas, where George McPhee, I think, learned a ton in his time in Washington, and then won a Stanley Cup. I don't think George is particularly patient. In fact, they go to the Cup Finals his first year, and basically him and Kelly McCrimmon determined that that team, wasn't good enough to win a Stanley Cup, and they start rebuilding it. And I think you have to have a core set of beliefs and a high standard, and be patient if you believe you have the people around that can accomplish that, but don't be afraid to make a change if you don't.
Yeah, that's so true. And I guess that's part of the, um, so much of the stories that get told in the book, you really go into people's background, and it's really clear that running a pro sports team, or at least one in the National Hockey League, it's not like you go to a university and get a degree
Right.
like you would if you wanted to be an accountant or a lawyer. Like, everybody had such a diverse path on how they sort of landed in that seat. Is there any underlying traits that you maybe picked up to say, gosh, if this was something you wanted to pursue, you better have these two or three things, if you want to be successful?
Yeah, I think I mean, one goes back to the ability to make difficult decisions and a willingness to do it and make unpopular decisions. So if the whole fan base is screaming to blow things up, and running a team back is super unpopular, like, if you believe that's what you have to do, having the kind of the fortitude to do it, I think, is important. I think there's a lot. I think you look at the personalities in that book. There's a lot of different ways to succeed, like, in terms of personality and management type. So that was another takeaway for me. Was, hey, Lou Lamoriello is very different than Megan Duggan, who's very different than Jim Nill or George McPhee. I do think almost to a person, every single one of them are constantly trying to get better, just personally and with the team. But there was just a lot of instances of what things they did to improve as people, and to learn, and to find mentors, but also taking that same approach to get constantly incrementally better within the organization. So kind of that relentless drive for, I guess, incremental improvement, I thought was interesting and pretty common as a theme throughout.
Yeah, I definitely picked up on that as well. And I'd be curious, like, you know, you should read the book and you start to look inward a little bit. I mean, and I manage a group of people. I know you manage a group of people now in your current role. Anything that you kind of reflected on personally?
Yeah, I mean, it had a big impact on me, because I was like living it, right, and I'm having these
Totally, yeah.
conversations, and I think probably guided how I wrote it, and how some of the stories I shared, and even some of the people I talked to. My goal was to have enough hockey in there and behind the scenes about trades or drafts to kind of satisfy those people that are like, I'm not managing anybody, but really, I really wanted people who are managing or know people that have, run a team or are coaching or whatever, to have concrete takeaways that say, okay, this is how you conduct an interview. Like, I now conduct interviews for prospective job applicants differently because of a conversation I had with
I
Julian
bet.
Brisebois. So, I think how you evaluate people, how you make decisions, how you can rely on others to guide you through things. All of these things have impacted me, and how I manage, for sure.
So last night I was watching the Canadians and Ducks. So two teams, and going through a rebuild, lots of young talent on display. And so I pull up their rosters while I'm watching the game, and of course I've got the book beside me, and I'm looking at their rosters on paper, and I'm like, man, these teams are like stacked, and you could see sort of the Ducks obviously just go get Jacob Trouba, and you're like, there's probably a scenario where either one of these teams in 2 years um, could be potentially in contention just based on the talent they have and one or two of those right moves. But at the same time, there's probably a much higher likelihood that they're the Buffalo Sabres
Right.
for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
And it just dawned on me, like looking at how these teams are built, and that on paper means a lot, but it would appear to be that there's some underlying events that need to happen, and I'm assuming that they're maybe not as measurable, be it the culture, that kind of turn that potential into reality. Anything that you would glean from that, and maybe what are some of those things that need to happen for
Yeah.
teams to win?
I mean, that's why even doing something like this is a challenge. Like I was,
It's fascinating, right?
yeah, like I was betting on Kyle Dubas, for instance. I'm like, oh, this team will figure it out. So if I interview him whenever that took place in 2021, by the time this is published in 2025 or whatever, some future date, like they'll have
Yeah,
won a Stanley Cup or whatever. So there's a bit of like
totally.
projection, and it's the same thing you're saying. You're sitting there watching the Ducks and Canadians saying, oh, if I was to release something in a couple of years, there's a good chance. Or
Yeah.
I'll say, like, one person I really wanted to be a part of this was Steve Eiserman, who, Steve's a private guy, not dying to do a bunch of,
Shocking he didn't
yeah,
participate.
shocking that Steve didn't want to carve out an entire day to spend time with me. Um, but like, I can tell you, I'm in Detroit, and fans here aren't dying to read about Steve Eiserman and how to build a winning team because it's not going particularly great in Detroit, right? So like, all these different factors go into it, and I think the person who was most interesting on that, Aaron, was Tom Dundon. Like he talked about, he's like, you can do it. Like he talked a lot. I mean, it's not surprising through numbers and probabilities. And, if you can increase your playoff chances from 51% to 53% over the course of it, and he's like, but even then it's a
3%
coin
chance of winning the
toss,
Stanley Cup. Like it
3%
was,
chance of winning a
yeah, it
Stanley
was
Cup.
so,
Like
yeah.
he's just rattling all these things off. And so he's just like, to me, you should measure success by winning percentage. Like over time, do you have the best winning percentage in the league? Not necessarily a Stanley Cup, but he's like, I realize that's not how nobody's saying great job Hurricanes, your winning percentage since Tom Dundon bought the team is, I don't even know what it is, right? So like but
Yeah.
he was fascinating to say, like, so he's acknowledging that there's probably things he can't measure, or there's luck that's part of winning a Stanley Cup. There's all of these things, and I think he believes it's his job year in and year out to turn the dial just enough so that those probabilities are as high as they possibly could be. And I mean, that's not a fun way to talk about winning or losing, but it that I think he's right.
I think he's absolutely right. And I'm sure, like, obviously in any other business, like if you operate a restaurant, you don't want to make a great steak, one night a year. You want to, have a
That's
consistently great steak every
right,
time
right.
somebody orders it. And
Yeah,
that's the business. But I would think too, like we all want to win championships, but in hindsight, I bet you could, again, I don't want to pick on the Toronto Maple Leaf fans, but if you could
yeah.
go to them and say, hey, instead of 40 years of this, what if you were just, in the mix every year, and, every couple of years you go 2 or 3 rounds, would you, which would you take? And they'd probably be like, in hindsight, I'd probably take the consistency, but
I don't know.
nobody gets into this arena to be
To
consistent,
be
right? Like,
to be, go to a conference championship or whatever. It's a tough one. And so like, it's the same thing with coaches. You could sit there and say somebody won a Stanley Cup or whatever, or didn't. Like I think one of the great teams from when I was in it every day as a National Hockey Raider, like those San Jose Sharks teams to me were great. Like I thought Doug Wilson was one of the best GMs like in the league by a lot, and I would put him in that top echelon, and didn't win a Stanley Cup. So do we look back at that era and say Doug was not a good GM, or Joe Thornton and Patrick Marleau and Joe Pavelski were not great players? I don't, but I know there's people that are like, yeah, win something. And, I don't know. It's a tough one.
well, the Tom Dundon chapter for me, anyways, was fascinating, and I guarantee I'll read it again. But I thought about this as well. Like I know the NHL is talking about, and we've already seen examples now in pro sports where private equity is getting involved, And, chances are, these folks are going to think very similarly to him on
Yeah.
how they operate a franchise. And I kept thinking, I'm like, man, like how much does, just obviously it's different if the Hurricanes aren't, I think they just announced like, it's like they just broke 100 straight sellouts. They're in the playoffs every year.
Yeah.
They've obviously got into the, kind of the top one or two teams. Like, given the success he has, like, how do you not um, lean into that a little bit, especially if that's, kind of those are the methods that you use to make your money in the first place?
Yeah, I think he's unique. I don't know if I would want my team owner calling the GM 20 times a day or whatever he does to poor Eric Tulsky. You know what I mean? Like I'm exaggerating, but I'm sure there's days where it feels like a lot. Uh, When I would ask people in the organization though about that, they would say where Tom gets not a pass. I mean, he's the owner; he can do whatever he wants. But where you give him credit is he he's knowledgeable on this stuff. Like he's watching the AHL team every night. He's watching. He's not just jumping in these big moments. We see it all the time in sports where they come in and make a coaching change. The owner forces a change or jumps in to make a trade, whatever, and they're only doing it in these kind of high pressure moments where Tom, to his credit, he's there every day and he's leaned in and he's learning and he's talking to agents and other GMs and I mean, I don't know if it's an ideal way, but to structure a team or to run things, because I know, like, I don't know if I wrote it in the book or not, but I did. I think like he doesn't particularly value a GM, and that's going to sound wrong because I think he values Eric Tulsky, and I know he valued Don Waddell, but like he
For
doesn't feel
sure.
like they can make that big a difference in terms of wins and losses. Like at the end of the day, and that's why when he bought that team, or at least when he bought it, like he didn't want to spend more than $500,000 a year to get, because he was just like there's how many of these jobs, he's like there's more than enough people that could do this, and so it's just a different perspective. And I think part of it is because he's in there doing it every day as part of it.
Well, I don't want to say it's a perfect storm, but the fact that he goes to Carolina, and I know just talking with their coaches, they said, they kind of iterate the same thing, but they also said like it's everything. It's like he wants to create the best fan experience. Like he walks and he wants to make sure we got the best food at the concessions. Like it's every aspect. And I think you hit on the book that it's just about creating value. But I'm like, the fact that he takes over a fledgling franchise in a non-traditional market, he's got Eric Tulsky, who, again, you touch on it, is probably the smartest guy in most rooms that he walks
Yeah,
into.
yeah.
I didn't realize his background, but I knew he was a smart dude. I didn't realize that he went to
He's
Harvard
like
and
next levels for
because
like, yeah.
yeah. So yeah, just it's fascinating.
Let me just like
But
on Tom, just to kind of get into his head and how, like, so as part of this, we grabbed lunch in the middle of our conversation and went and he's looking around this restaurant that we're at, and he's like, well, the hostess stand should be over there, and you could be more efficient if you did, like, he's like, this whole time he's analyzing where the restaurant is basically getting it wrong and how they could be a little bit more efficient, and if you cut that down over to there. And I'm like, Tom, is this just, do you just do this all the time? And he's like, yeah. He's like, he goes, it's a, a blessing and a curse. Like I can't
I
shut
bet
it
it is.
off. And he's like, if you ask me to do something creative, like design a logo, I know what I can't do, but he's like, I believe I can take any business or any situation and make it better and more efficient. And it's, it's a completely different process than anybody else.
Yeah. Well, I know there was a period there where he was doing a lot of interviews, and I know he did your podcast, The Full 60, which I would highly recommend that anybody listens to. But he's kind of gone quiet. I don't know if that's intentional, but I feel like the
Has
league
he?
was a little bit more interesting. Yeah, I feel like the league was a little bit more interesting when he was sharing his thoughts in front of a microphone. But you talk about sort of that dynamic where it's funny. A good friend of mine, he's a lawyer, and he went to UBC, and so he did an internship with the Canucks. And he talks about, like, this is like in the early '90s, that he goes, when I would go to like the Canucks front office, there was like this little common space, and there was a door there, and that was Pat Quinn's office, and then the next door was George McPhee's office, and then there was Dave Notis's office, and then there was a secretary. And he's like, Pat also had, the coach's office down by the dressing room. And, that dynamic has changed so much. And I think so much we talk about teamwork, in the, the player sense, but it's really clear the teamwork that exists within a front office. And I just recently I was talking to Jeff Tambellini. He's with the director of player development with the Kraken, but he's gonna speak at our conference in June. And he was saying, we were just talking about his role with the Kraken. He's like, yeah, he's like, I've got this team. He goes, but then I look over at the Maple Leafs, they've got 18 people
Yeah.
on their player development staff. And I'm like, man, that's a lot of opinions and ideas to sort of, make work in the stew. My question would be like, what do you learn about just teamwork specifically when it's a bunch of alphas in the room? And I don't say alphas just in like alpha male, because like Megan Dugan clearly like, uh, I
Type
mean,
A,
man,
like
is she
she
ever
is. Yeah,
impressive?
yeah,
Holy cow.
yeah.
I learned so much about her.
Um, I think the best teams aren't filling the room with alphas, and so George McPhee was great on this. He when they were building Vegas, he was like, the one thing is whether I'm talking about the person that's in charge of game ops or who's doing PR. He's like, we want the best in the industry at that position across the board. So he's like, we and then what we do when we are making big decisions, we have our war room and everybody has a seat at the table. So it's the opposite of what you're saying. It's not George McPhee and Kelly in the coach sitting down and making big decisions. He's like, everybody has a seat at the table and everybody I expect to voice an opinion. And he's like, oftentimes, he's like, I'm the quiet one. This is so like to me, maybe George is alpha, like certainly as a player, like played like one, but like I think as a leader, he's not dominating the conversation. He sees it as his job to get as many smart people in the room as possible, and then draw as many good ideas out as possible from all of them, and make sure they're all speaking. And then as a leader, you kind of distill it down, and you have to have the final say. But like that to me is it's aligned with what you're saying. Is these rooms have grown, and there's a lot of different kinds of voices now, and it's not three people making the decisions. In fact, I think Julian Brisebois said he wrote like a paper on this. At one point comparing the Montreal Canadiens front office, which was two people when they were winning multiple Stanley Cups, to how it was modern. And then he's like, now look at even in Tampa, like we have this massive operation, and it's a different job.
Yeah, don't let Tom Dundon get a hold of that paper.
Just, yeah, and then there's Carolina where there's 7
yeah.
people. No, but yeah, it's different.
No, but I think kind of in that too, like some of the little key takeaways, and I think anybody that reads this, if you're managing people, there's there's the hockey side of it, but there's just like the everyday aspect of managing people. And the other thing that really stuck with me, and you mentioned the interview part with Julian Brisebois and how we conducted interviews, like lots of highlighter in those few pages. The other piece was Jim Rutherford.
Yeah.
And him talking about like one of the things that he's learned, like he talks a lot about listening, talks about managing up, but I think specifically in the managing up part of when you feel like you hit a bit of a wall, like don't force the conversation, like, having that muscle to say, hey, I'm going to step back for a couple of days, let it marinate, think about it, and then maybe revisit it with a different approach. And again, so subtle, but I imagine in the same way that players work on their wrist shot and all these different skill sets, like those are probably the skills or the toolbox that you need to succeed in that line of work.
Yeah, he was good. So like I wanted Jim in there for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted like to have various people at different points in their career. So you didn't want it all to be a bunch of old school guys. I wanted just different people. And I think there was, at least for me, and I've been dealing with him like you have a long time. There's like this perception that I had that he was this fire from the hip kind of riverboat gambler type. And he's like, you know what, things aren't working. We're going to blow the things up, and we're going to make trades, and we're going to be aggressive. And it just wasn't true. Like as I spent time with him and people that he worked with, and had long conversation with Mike Sullivan, who was amazing for this, and Mike was just like, he's the opposite. He makes sure he's present all the time. On the road, he's going to dinner with the entire coaching staff, and he's just sitting at the end of the table listening, and occasionally throwing little kind of grenades into the conversation to get all the coaches talking. But he wants to know everyone's point of view, so that when he does make these trades that look aggressive or whatever, they're actually really well thought out, and he's really informed as a leader. And so I found that interesting. And then just the whole managing up thing is really smart. And Jim said, like, nobody wants to talk about this in leadership. Like, nobody wants to say you have to manage your boss, but he's like, kids manage their parents, and you manage your teacher as a student, and we're all like, you have to manage your boss, and that sometimes that looks like what you said. If you're not getting what you want, not forcing it through, and not giving up either. It's just pausing for a few days and then circling back and saying, hey, I've thought about this. What if we did it this way? And you know what I mean? And it's just
Totally.
different strategies. Like, he's really good on that. And again, when you talk about stuff I've personally implemented, I've realized, like, that's part of my job is communicating better with the people above me, so they understand what I'm doing. And like that was directly from these conversations.
No, the other one that really stuck out to me is Kyle Dubas and note taking, and he goes into
Yeah.
real detail as to how he keeps the note of like conversations. And at first you read that and you're like, man, this guy's a little bit neurotic. But I'll tell you what, like, two common traits, since we've done this show and had the amount of coaches that we've had on, when I get asked like what are the things that kind of all these people have in common, I'd say the two most commonalities are A, they started their career in the East Coast Hockey League or another minor league, and they kind of had to, book the bus, do the meals, hotel, like they had to learn how the whole thing ran. But the second thing is, in some form of another, they keep notes on their whole career. Like Ken Hitchcock has every one of his game cards. Jay Woodcroft takes as a book that he keeps notes on every conversation he has with players so he can refer back to it or keep ideas. And I thought that was just fascinating and something, again, that's so replicable for anybody. And it's a pain in the ass, but then in hindsight, you're like, man, that's no doubt that pays off, having that information on
Yeah.
hand all the time.
What Where Kyle's better at it than I am, like, so I'm sitting here and I have like 10 giant notebooks stacked next to. I'm a note taker just as an old
Are
like
you?
journalist, but like then they just stay in the notes. And what Kyle
Like
talked
he puts them
about
in a Google
was
Drive. Yeah.
puts them in a Google Drive, like that next step, or he takes notes while he's in it, but like he transfers it over, and he's like, he's got, and for like readers, if you like like, I'm a process like nerd, so I end up asking these people a lot of process questions. So
I
when they
bet.
say, yeah, I take notes, I'm like, no, can you tell me exactly, like, what do you do? And that's how it got into the Google Doc conversation. And he's like, okay, sure, I have a Google Doc set up for every GM I talk to. And he's like, so you talked to Bob Murray at the time, who was, the GM of the Ducks, and this is the example he used, and you're talking about a player. He's like, you think you're going to remember a month later what those details were, and you just don't. Like, we all think we're going to remember everything. And so he had one for every GM, and what the last conversation looked like, and who the player. And I don't know, that might be like the nerdiest bit of detail ever, but I just love that stuff. Like, I love to know, like, this is how these people, or the successful ones, are operating. I still
Well,
don't transfer it over though. I've got to take that next step.
okay. Well, we got to get set up on the G Drive. But you know what? It's so funny though. Like, like, just, I know in our line of work, like when we talk with pro coaches and we'll ask them like who would you want to hear speak at our event, or what topics would you
Yeah.
want covered? It's never like, hey, get somebody on stage to talk about the power play. It's like, can you get somebody from a different sport or even a different industry to talk about how they deal with, conflict with their staff, or
Yes.
how, they build culture, et cetera. It's all those idiosyncrasies, like whether it's note taking or, just kind of the operational aspects of leadership, I guess.
Yeah, and so that came up a lot too, where a lot of these GMs and presidents and execs, they do a lot of those conversations on the side. And Jim Nill talked about getting together with all of the Dallas GMs for something that ended up being really impactful for him, and they having everybody in one space and just talking best practices and how do you run your drafts, and like, so again, that just goes back to that notion of constantly trying to get better, and finding, taking advantage of your status in sports and saying, okay, it's not good enough that I'm going to NHL GM meetings and meeting with that group. It's how do I learn from, yeah, I'm forgetting his name now, but Kyle's really close with the Oklahoma City GM, who, in the NBA, who's
They're a
built,
wagon right now.
yeah, an incredible team. And this is a guy that I was trying to get, and it just, the timing didn't work out. But and forming these relationships across sports, that I find really fascinating.
Was there anybody that, that's a great example. Like when you had these conversations, was there perhaps anybody's name from a different sport, whether it was another GM, owner, et cetera, coach, like another leader that maybe people consistently pointed to and said, man, if I could be on a fly on the wall or have dinner with one person, it'd be that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, not surprising. Names that came up a few times were like the Bill Belichick's and the Nick Saban, and one of the fascinating things about the Lou Lamoriello chapter is just how many great coaches were part of that Providence. That organization ended up leading
I didn't know
to
that. Yeah,
Rick
that was cool.
Pitino
Yeah.
and Billy Donovan, and so it was
Yeah.
just fun for me to have one of my favorite conversations of the whole thing was a conversation with Billy Donovan, who as a hockey writer I'd never spoken with, and he got me fired up. By the end, I was ready to like run through a wall. And he's just like, "Here's what I learned from Lou Lamoriello." He's like, "Winning isn't an a la carte thing. You don't get to pick and choose what you get to do to be a successful organization or to win games. You have to do it all. Like it's not a buffet line." And he's like the losing teams or the players that don't succeed just want to pick what they want to do to win out of the buffet line. And he's like, "We learned from Lou. You have
Yeah.
to put in
Such
all
a
the
great
work.
line.
Isn't it great? It's
It's
not a
so good.
buffet line."
So good. So another line that wasn't in the book that, but I kept reflecting back on it. Have you seen the movie Heat?
Oh yeah. With De Niro and
Yeah.
Pacino,
So
yeah.
Neil McCulley, the character played by Robert De Niro, he has this line, one of the all-time great lines in cinematic history, and it's, "Don't let yourself get attached to anything you're not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner." And I thought about that line and the contrast of Julian Breezebaugh and Kyle Dubas in Pittsburgh, where Julian makes the decision to let go of some core players. Most notably Steven Stamkos lets him go maybe a little bit early, and Kyle is in a situation where he keeps that core together in Pittsburgh. And obviously, we're seeing this season there's two teams going in different directions, but I kept coming back to, man, like everybody that you talk to talks about the human side, the relationships, and how
Yeah.
important those are and how intentional they are. But at the same time, they talk about, as you put it, like the decisiveness and how you have to make tough decisions. And I just kept thinking, like, man, that's when you boil it down, that's really the art of leadership at that level, is to be able to balance those two things and still keep people on your side.
Yeah, it's really hard. And the version that Julian was going through when I was talking to him was the Ryan McDonough situation. And so Ryan, they win the Stanley Cups. He's a huge part of it. And basically has to get some younger players signed and essentially I don't know, threatens is the wrong word, but like would have put him on waivers before making that trade with Nashville. And and again, because I'm drawn to the human side too, and so I was just like I can sit here from a math perspective and say, yeah, easy. Ryan McDonough is this age. Here's the cap space you opened up. I'm like, well, how, like as a human who this guy like bled for your team, like how do you make that
Yeah.
decision? And he's just like, I know, he's like, it's even harder for me because I know the relationships the players have with them. And I know they all live on the same street in Tampa and their kids play together and their wives hang out. And now I'm sitting, and I'm just like, oh, and he still does it. Right. And so, and
Yeah.
then he does it. The thing happened with Stamkos and I'm like, yeah, I mean, so another thing that came out of it, and I don't even like, I didn't write about it, I don't think explicitly, but I think it's a lonely position. Like the coaches aren't fired up. Julian Breezebois sending Ryan McDonough out the door, so he's not getting bouquets from John Cooper in that moment in time. The players are pissed. So he's just got to sit there and make this decision. And man, that's a lonely place to be, I think.
I can't think if you reference it in the book or if I drew connected the dots to it. But did you talk about the book about the Kirby Smart comment about leadership?
Yeah.
Yeah, like that was a great reference, and I remember when that soundbite first came out, like just so true, right?
Yeah.
That it
What
is
did he
such a
say?
lonely
Like
position.
nobody wants to talk about what did Kirby Smart? Because
It's like nobody wants about like just the lonely part of the job, or just
yeah,
how, yeah, every
um,
decision you're basically, you're making a few people happy, but the equal amount of people are pissed at you.
yeah, it's like the
Paraphrasing.
unfun thing about you get to. It's fun to talk to George McPhee when he's got a ring on his finger and he's in that spot, but like I'm sure. I mean, I lived it. Like people were not happy with him and the Golden Knights when they were trading, you know, key parts of that first team to go to a Stanley Cup final, or they were firing Pete DeBoer or Gerard Gallant and people who are really well respected in the game. And people would say, oh, these guys in Vegas think they're so smart and they're smart, like they're just getting trashed, right? Um and you just do it because you believe. And I think the thing about George that I found so interesting was he clearly, and he talked about it, he learned from his experiences in Washington. He's like, I'm not messing around with coaches anymore. It didn't go well. They cycled through the coaches with the Capitals, and at one point he wanted to hire John Cooper and didn't do it. And probably the Adam Oates hire was probably one. I think he felt like in his gut wasn't going to work, and still, all these different decisions were made, and so he's just like, I'm done messing around with this in Vegas. And again, that doesn't lead to people being thrilled with you at times, but you just do it because you're convicted. And I think he was the one who said this, which really stuck with me. And a couple of people said versions of this, but he's like, the moment you're unwilling to make those decisions anymore, leading the team, is when you shouldn't be doing it anymore. Like there does become a time where you just don't have the fortitude and you delay it and you put it off. And he's like, that's when you shouldn't be doing it anymore.
I guess almost like when players say, like, I got into the off season and I wasn't willing to put the work in a train anymore. And that's when I knew it was time to retire. Like,
it's like the leader version of that. Right.
Yeah. Totally.
I just don't want to deal with the backlash, so I'm not going to do this. And then you're like, oh, that's an alarm bell.
You talk about, we talk about Megan Dugan, who seems like her career is just very much in its infancy, but she's destined for some great things. Eric Tulsky, obviously the GM in Carolina now, but for the long time was kind of the name that was brought up every time there was a GM vacancy around the league. Kyle Dubas, before he was the GM of the Leafs, he was sort of the wonder kid, with Sault Ste. Marie and then with the Leafs. And another name you bring up, and gosh, I teared up reading about Chris Snow and in the Brad Treliving chapter, but obviously somebody else that kind of came up and was so highly thought of. If you were advising a young person that said, hey, this is a job that I want to get into, like there's just so many more, I guess, entry points into the front office of a National League team, whether it's analytics, whether it's player development, would there be any sort of skill set or sort of path to say, hey, this might be a really good opportunity to cut your teeth early and maybe, develop those skills you need to ascend through an organization?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, and it's no different for me in like journalism and the media space. When I'm talking to young people, I think it's finding something that you're passionate about and really good at, and that you can make a clear like value prop to an organization. And so, I think there was a moment in time in hockey where analytics was that for sure. Like you could sit there there was such a need for it. You could go to a team and say, hey, here's my expertise. And so I think it's finding what that is. That, like, oftentimes when you talk to candidates or you talk to people that want to get into the game, and I'm sure you do this, you talk to people in coaching and they sit there, I'm like, oh, here's how it would benefit me if I got this job. And I'm like, no, you've got to convince, like, find the thing that you can genuinely help this team with. And sometimes that might just be, I'm willing to work all the time or whatever, you know what I mean? It might just be a work ethic or whatever. And hey, I will, my son is at Central Michigan and he wanted to get into coaching. And I'm like, you got to just do whatever they ask. And he was doing laundry. You know what I mean? Like he's like his first job was with the equipment staff. I'm like, that's great. You got, now you can sit and talk with the coaches, after practice. And so I think that's a value add. But I think if you're a young person breaking into something, you have to figure out what value can I bring to this person and how do I express that?
Totally. Speaking of, organizations that have grown, your organization, The Athletic, even just taking notes through this, I mean, your title, I think, has changed several times, and now you're the head of creative development. What's your day-to-day look like now? What does the head of creative development do?
It's, it's changed a ton. So, the creative dev at The Athletic it's all of our audio, all of our video, all of our newsletters, commercial opportunities with advertisers, around kind of new coverage areas. So we've got partnerships in like collectibles and fantasy sports that we're building out. So, new coverage areas, document, like the documentary space is interesting to us. So it's basically
I bet.
anything
Yeah.
that's not like the written story, which is where it all started at the Athletic, and helping just grow out these new areas of expansion, which I love, like building things and trying new things. And so so my day to day is like the conversations are all over the place. It's, but it's all of those areas.
I've got a question, and I've been I'm in good pals with James Myrtle, so
Oh yeah. Okay.
I got a text at some point years ago, and he's like, "You should download this app I'm working with now," and I was like, "Cool." It's like Toronto and Chicago,
Yeah.
um, but it's been an amazing story to watch. But the one thing that this is probably a bit of a nerdy question, but like if I go into my Athletic app and I looked at my saved content, probably predominantly a lot of them are, not surprisingly, features on coaches, but specifically like you guys did one recently on Mike Tomlin, and it's like
Yes.
players and staff telling their best Mike Tomlin stories. There's been ones on like the Bill Belichick one. I laughed out loud, some of the stories and one liners the players that recounted, and I read those and I'm like, they're amazing. But I'm also like, how did nobody land on this? Like, did we need a head of creative development to figure out that this was going to be like really interesting for sports fans to digest? So I'd just be curious to know, like, when you're, I'm assuming, in a room listening to all these ideas, like, A, how do you land on these? But B, it just seems like you guys get these insights that, maybe didn't exist before you did it.
Yeah. So the Tomlin one, that's a great one because it came from our group, because one of the areas we're like, okay, what are areas in sports that we think there'd be new audiences that maybe aren't reading the Athletic now, that would like, because if you think of our evolution, it was really teams, city centric and beat writer centric, and then national coverage. And I mean, so naturally, like I lean into leadership because I love, obviously, I've got the book and I'm fascinated by it. And so, one of the areas we're like, hey, if we just started writing stories in kind of the leadership space, but wasn't like over the top prescriptive, like you don't want to be like, here, 5 leadership secrets from, whatever LinkedIn kind of stuff you would see. But like, we're like, let's get people talking about a great leader, and Tomlin's name came up, and our, our
Yeah.
writers got together and did it. And it's like to me, this, and like that ties right to the book. Like my as we talk about how to do these stories at the Athletic, it's the same approach with my book. Is hopefully we're just telling stories that are interesting, and then at the end of the day, you write a couple things down, and you're like, hey, like this way that Mike Tomlin approaches. Like there was one story I loved where he was trying to get a player, like, a third stringer was playing, and he made him more comfortable by saying, hey, just picture the other team, picture the Eagles as whatever high school was his high school rival. And
I know.
so, like, that to me means Mike Tomlin cares enough about this third string fullback or whatever it was to know where he went to high school, and B, who that high school's rival was. And then is smart enough to pull that out where all of a sudden, like, now this guy's just like, oh man, this coach cares about me. Like that little anecdote. Um, if you write a story that says, hey, Mike Tomlin's secret to leadership is get to know your team and whatever, and share those details, people are like, well, this is
Yeah.
terrible. So you don't say all that, you just tell that story, and I think that can be really powerful. And I try to do it in this book. We try to do this at the Athletic in a different way, and yeah, that's the genesis of that.
Yeah, and I would add, just from that article, another one that just stuck with me was the interaction where he's like walking to a meeting and there's a player that's late for a meeting, and instead of like you know grilling him, just says, "Are you leading from the back or leading from the front?" and walks away. And it's like message received. And to me, like that's sort of the art of coaching, the art of leadership. Just really quick before we move, I'd be curious. Like you talk about leadership, what would be any coaches listening to this show, and there's a lot of them, any articles or profiles on the Athletic that you would point to say, hey, go back and do a search and look this one up, and you might take a few things away?
Um,
Not
yes,
to put you on the
there.
spot.
Well, first of all, if you're a coach listening to this and you like this, like, message me, because I want ideas. Like, this is an area that I love and I think is really fertile for people. And like the Tomlin story crushed, by the way. So like people want to read this stuff. And also the Steelers fans like it, and they're good this year. So there's a story on Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes' relationship. I think that, like, that if you just Google that recently, it's a longer read that I think Jason Jenks was the writer on that one as well. So that's good. And there's one, there's some Mike Leach stories that I thought were great.
Oh my
College
God, the
football
Mike,
coach
that's a great one. The Mike Leach one
Bruce
is,
Feldman did.
oh,
I,
unbelievable.
so like, And it's like the cool thing about as we try to like figure out this coverage area and how we can expand into it at the Athletic, I think we already have done it a lot without doing it intentionally. Just when you're covering people like this, you end up writing those types of stories, and so that's one. There's one on Pete Carroll and how he runs his meetings or ran his meetings with the Seahawks. I found really interesting. So those, yeah, I would start there and definitely get a hold of me if you're a coach listening to this and you like this stuff because I'm looking for ideas.
Yeah, I'm literally just looking through all my save stuff right now. It's great. I would also say, total aside, if
Yeah.
you're a coach, if you were ever having a bad day, go on YouTube, search up Mike Leach press conferences, and it'll just get instantly better. The guy was amazing. He's missed. Craig, really quick before I got two questions before we
Yeah,
let you
sure.
go.
Yeah.
No question that there's probably a lot of names that get excluded from the book, specifically around maybe who that next wave of leadership talent is in the National Hockey League. Are you able to maybe like highlight any names or people that were referenced of people saying, "Hey, that like watch out for this person. They're going to be next on that list."
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Megan Duggan is in the book because of that.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I had a few conversations, and like, just when people say stuff like, "Oh, I hear you're writing a leadership book," the best leader I've ever come across is Megan Duggan. Like, that's when you're like, okay, this is a person I need to talk to. Like, I had no prior relationship with Megan other than covering, Olympics or whatever. So like that was kind of going in cold and doing that chapter. Probably my favorite to report. Like, it became like one of those athletic stories where I was just calling one person after the next and saying essentially like, give me your best Megan Duggan story. And it was like really fun for me. Like, I could have reported that till the end of the time. So like, but like, otherwise, these ended up being on a lot of levels really personal. Like, these conversations, I hope they read that way, like with these leaders. And so a lot of the conversations were about them. And so but to me, like, people have asked, like, "Oh, who would you hire now, having done this?" Like, if I was to promote somebody, it would be Megan. Like, I would have zero issues naming her the GM of my expansion team tomorrow. Like, I think she's going to be
yeah.
she's going to be a great leader in the GM space one day in the NHL.
No, and it was great that she's highlighted. I think if anything, it's gonna inspire. And just part of that story, I think it's Cami Granato is quoted as talking about the NHL. I think it was at the draft in Nashville. They had an event where it was like for female executives in the National Hockey League, and she talks about, she was like, we show up and there's like 30 women there, and which isn't massive, but it's, man, has that ever signaled progress? So I think those types of stories, they're so important to be told. Last one that in the last 30 seconds became a two-parter, Craig. One is after people go and buy your book, what would be the other sports book and or leadership book that you would recommend? What's tops on your list? And two, what's your next book going to be about?
I like a lot of like business leadership stuff. I don't
What's your business leadership one?
like good to, the kind of the good to great type, like some of the
Oh
Adam
man,
Grant stuff. I like, don't like
yeah.
love it, all of it. Um, I like Seth Godin as an author for some reason, who's in marketing. And what I like about Seth is like, it's basically easy to read and practical, and basically just says get to it. I think the best advice Seth ever wrote, or I heard him on an interview that impacted me, was um, to not get too down if you read comments or reviews about your work, because if he's like, people don't put
I
themselves
could,
out there
yeah, great,
publicly.
yeah. That
And
seems
he said
timely.
he said basically, yeah, now it's helpful as when you have a book out, but he's like, if someone trashes your book, let's say, and gives it 1 star, instead of sitting there and being upset about it and what you did wrong, you just realize that the book wasn't for that person. Like, that, full stop. Like, that's the end. It's, you did nothing wrong. That wasn't your audience. Like, your audience is the person that gave it 5 star, that was like, hey, I took notes throughout. Like, that was your person. You reached that person. So you can't like sit here and obsess over comments or reviews. He's just like, write it off and just say, that wasn't my audience. I have my audience. It's this, whatever size it is, it's over here. And if someone doesn't like it, and so, I mean, there's been great books that I didn't like. It doesn't mean the author. So that, like, as a writer, that was really helpful to me.
You mentioned Good to Great, and I'll just share this because it's one of my prized possessions.
Oh, look
So
at,
I had Jeff Blashill. So I'd read the book Good to Great
yeah,
years ago. It's awesome. And then I don't know, would have been when he was with Detroit.
Hmm.
Jeff Blashiall's on the show, and I ask a lot of the coaches what their favorite books are and resources, and he
Yeah.
mentions Good to Great, which was kind of a, for you to say that kind of makes sense for an NHL coach to say it. I was like,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So I get this idea, and I reach out to Jim Collins through his website, and I just said, hey, I run this coaching conference. Here's a link to the episode with Jeff Blashiall. He's the coach of the Detroit Red Wings. Big fan of your work. Is there any scenario where you could come out and interview Jeff live on stage at our event? You could pick his brain in the same way that you
You're
interviewed
shooting your shot. Jim Collins doesn't do anything, by the way.
Well, here's the thing. So I get a response, and I wish I had the woman's name. It was his right hand. She was amazing. So she reaches out, does an interview with me, and she's like, I'm going to take it back to him. And she comes back to me and she's like, hey, we've got a few more questions. And I'm like, so I send Blash a note, and I'm like, hey, like this. I said I didn't even tell him I was doing. I'm like, hey, this thing could happen. And he's like, that's really cool. Anyways, I get three things happen. I get a personalized autographed copy of Good to Great from Jim Collins. I get an email from Jim apologizing, explaining that he's writing another book and he's in monk mode and he just doesn't have time. And attached to that email is an audio recording that he asked me to share with Jeff. And he took it was a 3-minute long audio clip just talking about how flattered he was. He did research into the whole thing. And I'm just like, man, like that's greatness right there. It was amazing. It was so impactful for me for somebody to take the time to do that. And
Awesome.
you know what? And I bring that up because you see so many examples of that in your book of these leaders that there's all this stuff we see on Sports Center, but there's all these behind the scene things and just how they treat people and lift people up.
Oh my gosh.
Like that's great lessons.
So, if you're listening to this still, God bless you. But also, like, if you're a book nerd, I actually, because people started reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, I've been buying the books referenced in the franchise that people mention. Were there any other ones that people?" And so people were like really interested in what all these people were reading. So I ended up putting like a PDF together that I put on my website,
Oh my God.
CraigCustance.com. That's just like, I'll send it to you. It's just like,
Yeah,
here's all the books mentioned, put a little checkbox thing. So if you want to go through it,
Amazing.
and a lot of it's Kyle, because we were in a bookstore and he literally was like, oh, there's Brene Brown's book on vulnerability. I forget what it's called. And he's like, that
Dare to Lead. Yeah.
Dare to Lead. He goes, that really impacted me when I hired Sheldon Keefe. He's like, it was, that's basically the book that got me there. And he was just going book by book and saying like, this impacted this decision, this impacted that decision. Like, he's like, these books found me at the right time. And so, I ended up sharing a lot of that. The one book that GMs love, and I think Doug Wilson was the first one to recommend it to me, and I just couldn't get into, was Thinking Fast and Slow. It's, I think Daniel Kahneman, like, I've never been able to.
So good.
It's supposed to be, I can't finish it. Like, it's over my head.
I've got,
I don't know what it is
about
on
him too. I would say
What's
Michael Lewis wrote a book. Michael Lewis, like Moneyball.
Yeah.
He wrote a book on Daniel Kahneman. Yeah, it's really good. I've got to grab it.
It's a book on the author. It's a book on the book. Maybe I can read that one.
It's a book on like how he came up and all that. Yeah, and it's really because he grew up in Israel, and it was him and basically a collaborator that came up with all that work, and it's fascinating. I want to ask you about this, and I promise I'll let you go. I just put this on my Christmas list. Have you read The Why Is Everything?
No,
but I've just came out on Football Coaches, like the whole Shanahan tree.
Oh, that's Michael Silver.
Yeah, right? Yeah. It just came out. I just saw it the other day, and I was like, oh man.
So we just hired Michael. I'm a fan.
Oh, did you? Who haven't you guys hired? Jesus.
He was the last one. We were like, okay, if we just get Silver, the bus is full. So yeah, he's amazing. I'm glad you. Yeah, I will. He'll be thrilled that he got a shout out here. I'll check that out. I just looked behind me because I'm like, what books? There's a book called if you're a writer or you just can't get stuff done. There's a book called Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott that is. I gift that one to writers, and it's, the story there is like, the anecdote she shares, her dad, like her brother had waited till the last second about a bird project that he needed to get done, and was like, hey, how am I going to get this done by tomorrow? And his dad just goes bird by bird, and you just start with the first bird, and it's like, basically it's a story about how to get, it's a writing book, but also how to get projects done. And I gift that book. I read it when I'm like stuck professionally and need some inspiration. So I'm an Anne Lamott fan too.
That's amazing. Hey, Craig, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, this is
Again,
awesome.
yeah, the book is The Franchise, the business of building winning teams. I know that everybody in our audience is in that business, so can't recommend it enough. I think fair to say you can find it wherever you buy your
Yeah.
books, whether online or if you're old fashioned and going to the actual bookstore, which you should do. But yeah, thanks so much for sharing time and congrats on all the success with the Athletic.
No, I appreciate it. This is awesome. Thanks for having me.